constructs built on high peaks. All around the hillsides, greenery waved at us. Bushes and palm trees. Nothing as far as the eye can see, unless you counted our ships in the bay. We had been going only a few hundred yards when we heard a sound from the undergrowth, and something streaked from the bushes to one side of us, and one of Roberts's men fell with a glistening, gore-filled hole where the back of his head had been. I know a club strike when I see one, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. A tremor of fear ran through the crew, who drew their swords, pulled muskets from their backs, and snatched pistols from their belts. Crouched. Ready. "The men native to this land will put up a fight, Edward," said Roberts quietly, eyes scanning the undergrowth, which was silent, keeping its secrets. "You're willing to push back if necessary, to kill if needed." I engaged my hidden blade. "You'll hear from me soon." And then I crouched, rolled sideways into the jungle, and became a part of it. 55. The natives, they knew their land well, but I was doing something they simply would not expect. I was taking the fight to them. And so the first man I came across was surprised to see me, and that surprise was his undoing. He wore nothing but a breech cloth, his black hair tied up on his head, a club still gleaming with the blood of a buccaneer upon it, and eyes wide with shock. The natives were only protecting what was theirs. It gave me no pleasure to slide my blade between his ribs, and I hoped his end was quick, but I did it anyway, and then moved on. The jungle began to resound to the noise of screams and gunshots, but I found more natives and dealt more death, until at last the battle was over and I returned to the main party. 8 had been killed in the battle. Most of the natives had fallen under my blade. "The guardians of the observatory," Bartholomew Roberts told me. "How long have their kind been here?" I asked him. "Oh, at least 1,000 years or more. Very dedicated men. Very deadly." I looked around at what remained of his group, his terrified, traumatized men, who had watched their shipmates picked off one by one. Then we continued our journey, climbing still, going up and up until we came upon it. Grey stone walls, a dark contrast with the vibrant jungle colours. A monolithic building rising way, way above us. The observatory. How had it not been seen, I wondered? How had it remained invisible? This is it, then. Aye, an almost sacred place. All it needs is a drop of my blood. In his hand appeared a small dagger, and he never took his eyes from mine as he used it to prick his thumb, then placed the red beaded finger into a tiny recess by the side of the door. It began to open. All 6 of us looked at one another. Only Bart Roberts seemed to be enjoying himself. "And the door opens," he said, with the voice of a showman, "after almost 80,000 years. He stepped to one side and ushered his men through. The nervous crew members looked at one another, then did as their captain ordered and began to move towards the door. And then, for some reason known only to himself, Roberts killed them. All 4 of them. With one hand he buried his dagger into the eye socket of the leading man, pushing his body aside at the same time as he drew his pistol and fired it into the face of the second man. The last 2 crew members had no time to react, as Black Bart drew his second pistol and fired point blank into the chest of a third man, pulled his sword, and ran the final survivor through. It was the same man who had brought the chest on deck, who'd looked to Roberts for some words of praise. He made an odd, choking sound, and Roberts held him there a second, then slid the cutlass home to the hilt and twisted it. The body on his blade went taut, and the deckhand looked at his captain with imploring, uncomprehending eyes, until his body relaxed, slid off the steel, and thumped to the ground, chest rising once, twice, then staying still. So much death. So much death. Jesus, Roberts, have you gone mad? He shook blood from his cutlass, then fussily cleaned it with a handkerchief. Quite the contrary, Edward. These wags would have gone mad at seeing what lies beyond this gate. But you, I suspect, are made of sterner stuff. Now pick up that chest and carry it hither. I did as he asked, knowing that to follow Roberts was a bad idea. A terrible bloody idea. But unable to prevent myself doing it. I'd come too far to back out now. Inside it was like an ancient temple. Dirty and decrepit, said Roberts. Not quite as I remember, but it has been over 80 millennia. I shot him a glare. More mumbo-jumbo. Oh, rot, that's impossible. His look in return was unknowable. Step as if on thin ice, Captain. On stone steps we descended through the centre of the observatory, moving into a large bridge chamber. All my senses were alive as I looked around and took in the vast openness of the space. Beautiful, isn't it? Said Roberts in a hushed voice. Aye, I replied, and found I was whispering. Like something out of a fairy tale, one of them old poems. There were many stories about this place once. Tales that turned into rumours, and again into legend. The inevitable process of facts becoming fictions, before fading away entirely. And now we entered a new room altogether. What could only be described as an archive. A huge space lined with low shelves on which were stacked hundreds of small vials of blood, just like the ones in the coffer, just like the one I had seen Torres use on Bartholomew Roberts. More blood vials. Yes, these cubes contained the blood of an old and ancient people, a wonderful race in their time. The more you talk, man, the less I understand, I said irritably. Only remember this. The blood in these vials is not worth a single real to anyone any more. It may be again, one day, but not in this epoch. We were deep within the bowels of the earth now, and walked through the archives into what was the main theatre of the observatory. Again it was astounding, and we stood for a second, craning our necks to gaze from one side of the vast domed chamber to the other. At one side of the chamber was what looked like a pit, with just a sloshing sound from far below to indicate water somewhere, while in the middle was a raised dais with what looked a complicated pattern carved into the stone. As Roberts bid me place the chest down, a low noise began. A low, humming sound that was intriguing at first, but began to build. What's that? I felt as though I was having to shout to make myself heard, although I wasn't. Ah, yes, said Roberts. A security measure. Just a moment. Around us the walls had begun to glow, letting off a pulsing white light that was as beautiful as it was unsettling. The sage walked across the floor to the raised platform in the middle, and put his hand to a carved indent in the centre. Straight away the sound receded, and the room around us was silent again, though the walls still glowed. So what is this place? I said to Roberts. Think of it as like a large spyglass, a device capable of seeing great distances. The glow, the blood, this device. My head was beginning to spin, and all I could do was stand and watch open-mouthed as Roberts reached into the coffer with practised fingers, as though it was something he'd done dozens of times before, and then pulled out a vial and held it up to the light, just as he had on the day we took possession of the chest. Satisfied, he bent to the raised dais in front of him and placed the crystal inside. And then something happened. Something I still can't quite believe. The glow on the walls seemed to ripple like mist, coalescing not into fog but into images, a series of opaque pictures, as though I was looking through a window at something. At 56. Calico Jack Rackham, as I live and breathe. But I wasn't looking at him. No. It was as though I was him, as though I was looking through his eyes. In fact, the only reason I knew it was Calico Jack was the Indian fabric of his coat sleeve. He was walking up the steps towards the old aviary. My heart leapt to see the old place, even more careworn and dilapidated than ever before. Which meant that this wasn't an image from the past. It wasn't an image I'd ever experienced myself, because I'd never seen the old aviary in its current state of disrepair. Hadn't visited Nassau since the true rot set in. And yet, I was seeing it. "This is bloody witchcraft," I spluttered. "No, this is Calico Jack Rackham, somewhere in the world at this moment." "Nassau," I said, as much to him as to myself. "This is happening right now. We're seeing through his eyes." "Aye," said Roberts. It wasn't as though I returned my attention to the image. It was simply there in front of me, as if I was part of it, inside it, which in a way I was, because when Calico Jack turned his head, the image moved with him. I watched as he looked towards a table where Anne Bonny sat with James Kidd. A long, lingering glance over Anne Bonny, over certain parts of Anne Bonny. The dirty bastard. But then, oh my God, she looked over from the table where she sat with James Kidd and returned his look. And I mean a proper lascivious look. That roving eye I told you about? She was giving old Calico Jack the full benefit. Bloody hell, they're having an affair. Despite everything, despite the wonders of the observatory, I found myself suppressing a chuckle to think of James Bonny, that treacherous turncoat, wearing the horns. Calico Jack. Well, the poxy git had marooned me, hadn't he? So there was no love lost there. But he did give us our weapons, ammunition and grub, and, well, he did have Anne warming his bed, so you had to hand it to him. Now Calico Jack was listening to Anne and James chatting. "I don't know, Jim," Anne was saying. "I haven't the faintest idea how to pilot a ship. That ain't work a woman does." What on earth were they cooking up? "Tosh, I've seen a score of ladies who can reef a sail and spin a capstan. And would you teach me to fight, with a cutlass like, and maybe how to handle a pistol?" "All that and more. But you have to want it and work for it. There's no stumbling into true success." And now Calico Jack confirmed what I thought. His disembodied voice seemed to echo off the stone. "Oi, lad, that's my lass you're making love to. Lay off or I'll cut you." "Up your arse, Rackham. Lad is the last thing you should be calling me." Oh yes, I thought. Was James Kidd about to reveal her disguise? James was reaching beneath her shirt, and Calico Jack was blustering. "Oh, is that right, lad?" Roberts removed the cube from the observatory controls, and the image evaporated. I bit my lip and thought of the jackdaw. Ade didn't like our current situation. He'd be dying to make sail. But he wouldn't do it without me. Would he? But now the glow that hung in the chamber before us became something else again, and all thoughts of the jackdaw's intentions were forgotten, as Robert said, "Let's try another. Governor Woodes Rogers," and placed another crystal cube into the console, and new images formed. We were seeing through the eyes of Woodes Rogers. Standing with him was Torres, and not far away was El Tiburon. Suddenly the vision was filled with the image of a blood vial being held up for examination by Rogers. He was speaking. "You have a bold idea, but I must think it carefully through." The observatory chamber room filled with the sound of Torres's reply. "A simple pledge of loyalty is all you need suggest to the House of Commons. An oath, a gesture, and a simple ceremonial dram of blood taken from the finger. That's all." Christ! Whatever Anne and Mary had been cooking up, it was nothing compared to this lot. Still trying to control the bleeding world, bleeding being the operative word. And doing it how? The English Parliament. Now Rogers was speaking. "The ministers may give me trouble, but it should be easy enough to convince the House of Lords. They do adore an excess of pomp and circumstance." "Exactly. Tell them it's a show of fealty to the king, against those revolting Jacobites." "Yes, indeed," replied Rogers. "The crucial detail is the blood. You must get a sample from each man. We want to be ready when we find the observatory." "Agreed." Roberts removed the cube from the console and looked at me, triumph in his eyes. Now we knew what the Templars were plotting. Not only that, but we were one step ahead of them. The images had gone, the strange glow had returned to the walls, and I was left wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Meantime, Roberts pulled something from the console and held it aloft. A skull. The skull in which he'd placed the vials of blood. "A precious tool, you see." "Sorcery, that's what it is," I said. "Not so. Every mechanism that gives this device its light is a true and physical thing. Ancient, yes, but nothing supernatural or strange." I looked doubtfully at him, thinking, "You're kidding yourself, mate," but decided not to pursue it. "We'll be masters of the ocean with that," I said. Wanting to hold the skull, reaching out to take it from him and overcome with a desire to feel the weight of it in my palm, I felt a tremble as he came forward with it, his hand outstretched. But then, instead of giving it to me, he whipped it round, striking me in the face with it and knocking me across the floor of the observatory and over the precipice of the pit. I fell, slamming into the stone on the way down, whipped by the vegetation that clung to the rock face, but unable to get a grip on it and stop my fall. I felt a searing pain in my side, then smacked into the water below, thanking God I had the presence of mind to turn my fall into the semblance of a dive. From that height, that instinct might have saved my life. Even so, my entrance into the water was a messy one. I crashed into it and floundered, swallowing water, trying not to let the pain in my side drag me under. As I broke the surface and gasped for breath, I looked up, only to see Roberts gazing down on me. "There's nothing in my code about loyalty, young man," he taunted me, his voice echoing in the space between us. "You played your role, but our partnership is done." "You're a dead man, Roberts!" I roared back, only I couldn't quite manage a roar. My voice was weak. And anyway, he'd left, and I was too busy trying to tend to the flaming pain in my side and get myself to safety. When I collected myself, what I found was a branch sticking from my flank, the wound colouring my robes red. I yanked it out with a scream, tossed the stick away, and clenched my teeth as I held the wound, feeling blood seep through my fingers. "Roberts, you bastard! You bastard!" Somehow, despite the pain, I managed to climb back up the walls of the pit to the observatory. I retraced my steps, through the bridge chamber, and past the corpses at the entrance, limping back down to the beach, pain sweat pouring off me. But as I stumbled out of the long grass and onto the beach, what I saw filled me with anguish. The jackdaw, my beloved jackdaw, had left. It was just the rover anchored offshore now. And there, where the beach met the sea, was moored a yawl, the coxswain and rowers silent sentinels with the sea at their backs as they awaited their captain, Captain Bartholomew Roberts, who stood before me. He crouched. His eyes flashed, and he smiled that peculiar, joyless smile of his. "Oh, your jackdaw has flown, Edward, eh? That's the beauty of a democracy. The many outvote the one. Aye, you could sail with me, but with a temper as hot as yours, I fear you'd burn us all to cinders. Luckily, I know the king's bounty on your head is a large one, and I intend to collect." The pain was too much. I could hold it together no more, and felt myself passing out. The last thing I heard as the darkness claimed me was Bartholomew Roberts softly taunting me. "Have you ever seen the inside of a Jamaican prison, boy? Have you?" Part 4. 57. November 1720. A lot can happen in 6 months, but in the 6 months to November 1720, it happened to other people. Me, I was mouldering in jail in Kingston, while Bartholomew Roberts became the most feared pirate of the Caribbean, commanding a squadron of 4 vessels, his flagship, the Royal Fortune, at its head. I was trying and failing to sleep on a roll on the floor of a cell so cramped I couldn't lie straight. I was picking maggots from my food and holding my nose to get it down. I was drinking dirty water and praying it wouldn't kill me. I was watching the striped grey light from the bars of the door and listening to the clamour of the jail, the curses, night-time screams, a constant clanging that never ceased, as though someone somewhere spent all day and night rattling a cup along the bars. And sometimes I was listening to my own voice just to remind myself that I was still alive, and I would curse my luck, curse Roberts, curse the Templars, curse my crew. I had been betrayed, by Roberts, of course, though that was no surprise, but also by the jackdaw. My time in jail gave me the distance I needed to see how my obsession with the observatory had blinded me to the needs of my men, and I stopped blaming them for leaving me at Long Bay. I'd decided if I were lucky enough to see them again, I'd greet them like brothers and tell them I bore no grudge, and offer apologies of my own. Even so, the image of the jackdaw sailing away without me burned like a brand on my brain. Not for much longer. No doubt my trial approached, though I had yet to hear, of course, and after my trial would come my hanging. Yesterday they had one, a pirate hanging, I mean. The trial was held in Spanish Town, and 5 of the men tried went to the gallows the day after at Gallows Point. They hanged the other 6 the next day in Kingston. One of those they hanged yesterday was Captain John Rackham, the man we all knew as Calico Jack. Poor old Jack. Not a good man, but not an especially bad one either. And who can say fairer than that? I hoped he'd managed to get enough liquor down him before they sent him to the gallows. Keep him warm for the journey to the other side. Thing was, Calico Jack had a couple of lieutenants, and their trial was to start this very day. I was due to be brought up into the courtroom, in fact, where they said I might be needed as a witness, although they hadn't said whether for the defence or the prosecution. The 2 lieutenants, you see, were Anne Bonny and Mary Read. And therein lies a tale. I'd witnessed the story, beginning with what I'd seen at the observatory. Calico Jack and Anne Bonny were lovers. Jack had worked his charm, tempted her away from James, that scurvy toad, and taken her to sea. On board she'd dressed as a man, and she wasn't the only one. Mary Read was aboard ship too, dressed as James Kidd, and the three of them, Calico Jack, Anne, and Mary, were all in on it. The two women wore men's jackets, long trousers, and scarves round their necks. They carried pistols and cutlasses, and were as fearsome as any man, and more dangerous, what with having more to prove. And for a while they sailed the neighbourhood, terrorising merchant ships, until earlier in the year when they stopped off at New Providence. There, on 22nd of August, the year of our Lord 1720, Rackham and a load of his crew, including Anne and Mary, stole a sloop called the William from Nassau Harbour. Of course, Woodes Rogers knew exactly who was responsible. He issued a proclamation and dispatched a sloop crammed with his own men to catch Calico Jack and his crew. But old Calico Jack was on a roll, and in between splicing the main brace, which is to say, carousing, he attacked fishing boats and merchant ships, and a schooner. Rogers didn't like that. He sent a second vessel after him. But old Calico Jack didn't care, and he continued his piracy westward until the tip of Jamaica, where he encountered a privateer by the name of Captain Barnett, who saw the opportunity to make a bit of money in return for Jack's hide. Sure enough, Jack was boarded, and his crew surrendered, all apart from Mary and Anne, that was. From what I heard, Jack and his crew had caroused themselves stupid, and were drunk or passed out when Barnett's men attacked. Like hellcats, Mary and Anne cursed out the crew, and fought with pistols and swords, but were overcome. And then the whole lot of them were taken across the island to Spanish Town jail. And like I say, they'd tried and hanged Jack already. Now it was the turn of Anne and Mary. I hadn't seen many courtrooms in my life, thank God, but even so I'd never seen one as busy as this. My guards led me up a set of stone steps to a barred door, opened it, shoved me out into the gallery and bid me sit. I gave them a puzzled look. What's going on? But they ignored me and stood with their backs to the wall, muskets at the ready in case I made a break for it. But make a break where? My hands were manacled, men were wedged into the gallery seats all around. Spectators, witnesses, all of them come to lay eyes on the two infamous women pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. They stood together before the judge, who glared at them and banged his gavel. "The charges, sir, I will hear them again," he called to the bailiff, who stood and cleared his throat. "His Majesty's Court contends that the defendants, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, did piratically, feloniously, and in a hostile manner, attack, engage, and take 7 certain fishing boats." During the minor uproar that followed, I sensed somebody sit behind me. 2 people, in fact, but paid them little mind. "Secondly," continued the bailiff, "this court contends that the defendants lurked upon the high seas and did set upon, shoot at, and take 2 certain merchant sloops, thus putting the captains and their crews in corporeal fear of their lives." And then matters of court receded into the background, as one of the men sitting behind me leaned forward and spoke. "Edward James Kenway." I recognised the voice of Woodes Rogers at once. "Born in Swansea to an English father and Welsh mother. Married at 18 to Miss Caroline Scott, now estranged." I lifted my manacles and shifted round in the seat. Neither of my guards with their muskets had moved, but they watched us carefully. Beside Rogers, every inch the man of rank, sat Laureano Torres, dapper and composed in the balmy heat of the courtroom. They weren't here on pirate hunting business, though. They were here on Templar business. "She is a beautiful woman, I'm told," said Torres, with a nod of his head in greeting. "If you touch her, you bastards," I snarled. Rogers leaned forward. I felt a nudge at my shirt and looked down to see the muzzle of his pistol in my side. In the time since my fall at the observatory, I had by some miracle avoided gangrene or infection, but the wound had never quite healed. He didn't know about it, of course. He couldn't have. But he'd still somehow managed to prod it with the barrel of his gun, making me wince. "If you know the observatory's location, tell us now, and you'll be out of here in a flash," said Rogers. Of course. That was why I hadn't felt the burn of the hangman's noose up to now. "Rogers can hold these British hounds at bay for a time," said Torres. "But this will be your fate if you fail to cooperate." He was indicating the courtroom where the judge was speaking, where witnesses were telling of the awful things Anne and Mary had done. Their warning over, Torres and Rogers stood just as a female witness described in breathless detail how she'd been attacked by the two women pirates. She'd known they were women, she said, by the largeness of their breasts. The court laughed at that until the laughter was silenced by the rap of the judge's gavel, the sound drowning out the slam of the door behind Rogers and Torres. Anne and Mary, meanwhile, hadn't said a word. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" I'd never known them lost for words before, but here they were, silent as the grave. Tales of their derring-do were told, and they never once butted in to correct anything egregious, nor even said a peep when the court found them guilty. Even when they were asked if they could offer any reason why sentence of death should not be passed. Nothing. So the judge, not knowing the two ladies, and perhaps taking them for the reticent sort, delivered his sentence. Death by hanging. And then, and only then, did they open their mouths. "My lord, we plead our bellies," said Mary Read, breaking their silence. "What?" said the judge, paling. "We are pregnant," said Anne Bonny. There was uproar. I wondered if both the Sproggs belonged to Calico Jack, the old devil. "You can't hang a woman quick with child, can you?" called Anne over the noise. The courtroom was in turmoil. As if anticipating my thoughts, one of the guards behind nudged me with his musket barrel. "Don't even think about it." "Quiet! Quiet!" called the judge. "If what you claim is true, then your executions will be stayed, but only until your terms are up. Then I'll be up the doff the next time you come knocking," roared Anne. That was the Anne I remembered, with the face of an angel and the mouth of the roughest Jack Tar. And she had the court in uproar again as the red-faced judge hammered at the bench with his gavel and ordered them removed, and the session broke up in disarray. 58. Edward Kenway, do you remember you once threatened to cut off my lips and feed them to me? Floriano Torres's face appeared from the gloom outside my prison cell door, framed by the window, divided by the bars. "I didn't do it, though," I reminded him, my disused voice croaking. "But you would have done." "True. But I didn't." He smiled. "The typical terror tactics of a pirate, unsophisticated and unsubtle. What say you, Rogers?" He lingered there too. Woodes Rogers, the great pirate hunter, hanging about near my cell door. "Is that why you've been denying me food and water?" I rasped. "Oh," chuckled Torres, "but there is much, much more to come. We have the little matter of the observatory's location to extract. We have the little matter of what you did to Hornigold. Come, let us show you what lies in a store. Guards!" Two men arrived, the same pair of Templar stooges who'd escorted me to the courtroom. Torres and Rogers left as I was manacled and leg irons were fitted. And then, with my boots dragging on the flagstones, they hauled me out of the cell and along the passageway, out into the prison courtyard, where I blinked in the blinding sun breathed fresh air for the first time in weeks, and then, to my surprise, out of the main prison gates. "Where are you taking me?" I gasped. The light of the sun was too blinding. I couldn't open my eyes. They felt as though they were glued together. There was no reply. I could hear the sounds of Kingston, daily life carrying on as normal around me. "How much are they paying you?" I tried to say. "Whatever it is, let me go and I'll double it." They came to a halt. Good man, I mumbled. "I can make you rich. Just get me." A fist smashed into my face, splitting my lip, breaking something in my nose that began to gush blood. I coughed and groaned. As my head lolled back, a face came close to mine. "Shut up!" I blinked, trying to focus on him, trying to remember his face. "I'll get you for that," I murmured. Blood or saliva ran from my mouth. "You mark my words, mate. Shut up, or next time it'll be the point of my sword." I chuckled. "You're full of shit, mate. Your master wants me alive. Kill me and you'll be taking my place in that cell. Or worse." Through a veil of pain, blood, and piercing sunlight, I saw his expression darken. "We'll see about that," he snarled. "We'll see about that." And then the journey continued, me spitting blood, trying to clear my head and mostly failing, until we came to what looked like the foot of a ladder. I heard the murmured voices of Torres and Rogers, and then a creaking sound coming from just overhead. And when I raised my chin and cast my eyes upwards, what I saw was a gibbet. One of the stooges had climbed the ladder and unlocked it, and the door opened with a complaint of rusty metal. I felt the sun beat down upon me. I tried to say something, to explain that I was parched and could die in the sun, and that if I did that, if I died, then they'd never find out where the observatory was. Only Black Bart would know, and what a terrifying thought that was. Black Bart in charge of all that power. He's doing that right now, isn't he? That's how he got to be so successful. But I never got the chance to say it, because they'd locked me in the gibbet. Locked me in the gibbet to let the sun do its work. Let it slowly cook me alive. 59. At sundown, my two friends came to fetch me and take me back to my cell. My reward for surviving was water, a bowl of it on my cell floor, just enough to dab on my lips, keep me alive, to use on the blisters and pustules brought up by the sun. Rogers and Torres came. "Where is it? Where is the observatory?" With cracked, desiccated lips, I smiled at them but said nothing. "He's robbing you blind, isn't he? Roberts, I mean. He's destroying all your plans." "You want to go back there tomorrow?" "Sure," I whispered. "Sure. I could do with the fresh air." It wasn't every day. Some days I stayed in my cell. Some days they only hung me for a few hours. Where is it? Where is the observatory? Some days they left me until well after nightfall, but it wasn't so bad when the sun went in. I was still crumpled into the gibbet like a man stuck in a privy, every muscle and bone shrieking in agony. I was still dying of thirst and hunger, my sunburnt flesh flaming. But still, it wasn't so bad. At least the sun had gone in. "Where is it? Where is the observatory?" Every day I'm up there he's a bigger pain in the arse, isn't he? Every day wasted is Black Bart's triumph over the Templars. There's that, at least. "You want to go back there tomorrow?" Sure. I wasn't sure I could take another day. In a strange way, I was trusting them not to kill me. I was trusting in my resolve being greater than theirs. I was trusting in my own inner strength. But for another day I hung there, crouched and crumpled in the gibbet. And when night fell again, I heard the guards taunting me, and I heard them gloating about Calico Jack and how Charles Vane had been arrested. Charles Vane, I thought. Charles Vane. I remember him. He tried to kill me. Or did I try to kill him? And then the sounds of a short-pitched battle, bodies falling, muffled groans, and then a voice. "Good morning, Captain Kenway. I have a gift for you." Very, very slowly, I opened my eyes. On the ground below me, painted grey in the dead light of the day, were two bodies. My friends, the Templar Stooges. Both had slashed throats. A pair of crimson smiles adorned their necks, and crouching by them, rifling through their tunics for the gibbet keys, was the assassin Tabai. I assumed I'd never see him again. After all, the assassin Tabai was not the greatest supporter of Edward Kenway. He probably would just as soon have slit my throat as rescue me from jail. Fortunately for me, he chose to rescue me from jail. But, "Do not mistake my purpose here," he said, climbing the ladder, finding the right key for the lock, and being good enough to catch me when I almost fell forward from the gibbet. He had a bulging leather flask and held the teat to my lips. As I gulped, I felt tears of relief and gratitude pouring down my cheeks. "I have come for Anne and Mary," he was saying as he helped me down the ladder. "You owe me nothing for this, but if you would lend me your aid, I can promise you safe passage from this place." I'd collapsed to the ground, where Tabai allowed me to gather myself, handing me the leather flask once again. "I'll need weapons," I said, after some minutes. He smiled and handed me a hidden blade. It was no small thing for an assassin to hand an interloper a blade. And as I crouched on the ground and strapped it on, I realized I was being honored in some way. The thought gave me strength. I stood and engaged the steel, worked the action of the blade, then slid it home. It was time. Time to go and save Anne and Mary. 60. He had some distractions to set off, he said, so I was to look for the women while he saw to that. Fine. I knew where they were being held, and not long later, when the first of his explosions gave me just the distraction I needed, I was able to slip back into the prison compound and make my way there. Then, as I drew closer, what I heard was screaming, and the unmistakable voice of Anne Bonny. "Help her! For God's sake, fetch help! Mary's ill! Somebody, please!" In return, I heard the sound of soldiers trying to shut her up, thumping at the bars of her cell with their musket butts. Not to be silenced, Anne was shrieking at them now. "She's ill! Please, she's ill!" Anne was screaming. "She's dying!" "The dying pirate, there's your difference," one of the men was saying. I ran now, heart thumping, feeling the pain at my side, but ignoring it as I turned a corner in the corridor of the cell block, one hand on the cool stone wall to steady my progress, and the other engaging the blade at the same time. The guards were already rattled by Tabai's explosions and Anne's screaming. The first one turned and raised his musket, but I swept my blade under and up, thrusting it through his rib cage, gripping the back of his head, and wrenching it into his heart at the same time. His mate had turned at the sound of the body thumping to the stone, and his eyes widened. He reached for his pistol, but I got to him before his fingers curled round the grip, and with a shout leapt and struck downwards, plunging the blade into him too. Stupid move. I wasn't in a condition for that kind of action. Immediately I felt a searing pain along my side. Pain like fire that began at the wound and then rolled up and down my body. In a tumble of flailing arms and legs, I fell with my blade embedded in the guard, landing badly but pulling it free as I rolled to meet the attack of the last guard. Thank God. Tabai appeared from my right, his own blade engaged, and seconds later the last guard lay dead on the stone. I gave him grateful eyes, and we turned our attention to the cells, to the screaming. There were 2 cells beside one another. Anne stood, her desperate face pressed between the bars. "Mary," she was pleading. "See to Mary." I didn't need telling twice. From a guard's belt I liberated the keys and tore open Mary's door. Inside she was using her hands for a pillow on the low, dirty cot where she lay. Her chest rose and fell weakly, and though her eyes were open, she stared at the wall without seeing it. "Mary," I said, bending to her and speaking quietly. "It's me, Edward." She breathed steady but ragged breaths. Her eyes stayed where they were, blinking but not moving, not focusing. She wore a dress, but it was cold in the cell, and there was no blanket to cover her, no water to touch her parched lips. Her forehead was shiny with sweat and cauldron hot when I put a hand to it. "Where's the child?" I asked. "They took it," replied Anne from the door. "The bastards." My fists clenched. "No idea where she is," continued Anne, and suddenly cried out in pain herself. "Jesus, that's all we need." "Right, let's go." As gently as I could, I pulled Mary to a sitting position, then swung her arm round my shoulder and stood. My own wound grumbled, but Mary cried out in pain, and I could only imagine the agony she was going through. After childbirth, she needed rest. Her body needed time to recover. "Lean on me, Mary," I told her. "Come on." From somewhere came the shouts of approaching soldiers. Tabai's distractions had worked. They'd given us the time we needed, but now the troops had recovered. "Search every cell," I heard. We began stumbling along the passageway back towards the courtyard, Tabai and Anne forging ahead. But Mary was heavy, and I was weak from days and nights spent hung in the gibbet, and the wound in my side. Christ, it hurt! Something must have torn down there, because the pain flared, and I felt blood, warm and wet, course into the waistband of my breeches. "Please help me, Mary," I begged her, but I could feel her body sag as if the fight was leaving her, the fever too much for it. "Stop, please," she was saying. Her breathing was even more erratic. Her head lolled from side to side. Her knees seemed to have given way, and she sank to the flagstones of the passageway. Up ahead, Tabai was helping Anne, whose hands clutched at her stomach, and they turned to urge us on, hearing more shouting from behind us, more soldiers arriving. "There's no one here," came the shout. So now they'd discovered the breakout. More running feet. Tabai and Anne reached the door to the courtyard. A black square became a grey one, and night air rushed into the passageway. Guards behind us. Ahead, Tabai and Anne were already across the courtyard and at the main gate, where the assassin surprised a guard who slid down the wall, dying. Anne was screaming now and needing help as they clambered through the wicket door of the prison compound and out into a night glowing orange with the fire of Tabai's explosions. But Mary couldn't walk. Not any more. I grimaced as I bent down and scooped her up, feeling another tearing sensation in my side, as though my wound, though a year old, simply couldn't cope with the extra weight. "Mary!" I could carry her no longer, and had to lay her down on the stones of the courtyard. From all around us I could hear the sound of tramping boots and soldiers calling to one another. Fine, I thought. Let them come. Here is where I'll stand and fight. It's as good a place to die as any. She looked up at me, and her eyes focused, and she managed to smile before a fresh surge of pain made its way through her body. "Don't die on my account," she managed. "Go." I tried to say no, but she was right. I laid her down and tried to make her as comfortable as possible on the stones. My eyes were wet when I spoke. "Damn it! You should have been the one to outlast me." She smiled a ghostly smile. "I've done my part. Will you?" Her image divided as though viewed through diamonds, and I palmed tears from my eyes. "If you came with me, I could," I urged her. She said nothing. "No, please, don't go. Not you." "Mary." She was trying to say something. I put my ear to her lips. "I'll be with you, Kenway," she whispered. Her final breath was warm on my ear. "I will." I stood up and looked down at Mary Read, knowing there would be time to mourn her later, when I would remember a remarkable person, perhaps the most remarkable I ever knew. But for the moment I thought of how the British soldiers had let this good woman give birth, ripped her baby from her, then left her wounded and feverish in a prison cell, no blanket to cover her, no water to touch her lips. I heard the first British soldiers coming into the courtyard behind me, just in time to exact a little revenge before I make my escape. I engaged the blade and span to meet them. 61. I guess you could say I did a bit of drinking after that, and I saw people in my delirium, figures from the past, Caroline, Woodes Rogers, Bartholomew Roberts, and ghosts too, Calico Jack, Charles Vane, Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Thatch, and Mary Read. Eventually, after a binge that lasted how long I couldn't say, salvation came in the form of Adewale. He came to me on the beach in Kingston, and I thought he was another ghost at first, another figure from my visions, come to taunt me, come to remind me of my failings. "Captain Kenway, you look like a bowl of plum duff." One of my visions. A ghost. A trick my poor hungover mind is playing on me. And yes, while we're on the subject, where is my bottle of liquor? Until when he reached a hand to me and I reached back, expecting his fingers to become wisps of smoke, to disappear into nothing. They were real. Hard as wood, just as reliable, and real. I sat up. Christ, I've got a head for 10. Adewale pulled me up. "On your feet." I stood, rubbing my poor, throbbing head. "You put me in a spot, Adewale. After you left me with Roberts, I should have hard feelings about seeing you here." I looked at him. But mostly I'm bloody glad. "Me too, brother. And you'll be chuffed to know your jackdaw is still in one piece." He took me by the shoulder and pointed out to sea. And maybe it was the drink making me feel extra emotional, but tears filled my eyes to see the jackdaw once again. The men stood at the gunwales, and I saw them in the rigging and their faces at the hatches of the stern guns, every man jack of them looking over to the beach, to where Adewale stood with me now. They came, I thought, and a tear rolled down my cheek that I brushed away with the sleeve of my robes, a parting gift from Artabai, though I'd done little to honour them since. "Shall we set sail?" I asked him, but Adewale was already walking away, further up the beach towards inland. "You're leaving?" I called after him. "Aye, Edward, for I have another calling elsewhere." "But When your hat and your head are ready, visit the assassins. I think you will understand then. So I took his advice. I sailed the Jackdaw to Tulum, back to where I had first discovered my sense, and met Artabai. There I left the crew on board and went in search of Artabai, only to arrive in the aftermath of an attack, walking into the smouldering, smoking ruins of an assassin village, and finding Adewale there too. This, then, was his calling. Jesus, Adewale. What the hell happened here? You happened here, Edward. The damage you caused 6 years ago has not been undone. I winced. So that was it. The assassins were still feeling the repercussions of those maps I'd sold to the Templars. I looked at him. I'm not an easy man to call a friend, am I? Is that why you're here? To fight beside a man so driven by personal gain and glory is a hard thing, Edward. And I have come to feel the assassins, and their creed is a more honourable course. So that was it. The words of Mary Read and Artabai had been wasted on me, but Adewale had been heeding them. I wished I'd made more effort to do the same. Have I been unfair? He prompted. I shook my head. For years I've been rushing around, taking whatever I fancied, not giving a tinker's cuss for those I hurt. Yet here I am, with riches and reputation, feeling no wiser than when I left home. Yet when I turn round, look at the course I've run, there's not a man or woman I love left standing beside me. A new voice spoke up. Artabai. There is time to make amends, Captain Kenway. I looked at him. Mary. Before she died, she asked me to do good by her, to sort out the mess I'd made. Can you help me? Artabai nodded. He and Adewale turned towards the village, and I walked alongside them. Mary was fond of you, Edward, noted Artabai. She saw something in your bearing that gave her hope you might one day fight with us. He paused. What do you think of our creed? He said. We both knew that 6 years ago, Jesus, 1 year ago, I would have scoffed and called it silly. Now, though, my answer was different. It's hard to say. For if nothing is true, then why believe anything? And if everything is permitted, why not chase every desire? Why indeed? Smiled Artabai mysteriously. My thoughts collided in my head. My brain sang with new possibilities. It might be that this idea is only the beginning of wisdom, and not its final form, I said. That's quite a step up from the Edward I met many years ago, said Artabai, nodding with satisfaction. Edward, you are welcome here. Thanking him, I asked, How's Anne's child? He shook his head and lowered his eyes, a gesture that said it all. She's a strong woman, but not invincible. I pictured her on the deck of the William, cursing her crewmates as cowards. It was said she'd fired shots at the men as they cowered drunk below decks. I could well believe it. I could well imagine how terrible and magnificent she'd been that day. I went to where she sat and joined her, staring over the treetops and out to sea. She hugged her own legs and turned her pale face to me with a smile. Edward, she said in greeting. I'm sorry for your loss, I said. I knew a thing or two about loss, learning more every day. If I'd stayed in prison, they'd have taken him from me, she sighed as she turned her face into the breeze. And he'd now be alive. Might be this is God's way of saying I ain't fit to be a mum, carrying on like I do, cursing and drinking, and fighting. You are a fighter, aye. In prison I heard stories of the infamous Anne Bonny and Mary Read taking on the King's Navy together. Just the pair of you. She gave a laugh that was partly a sigh. It's all true. And we would have won that day if Jack and his lads weren't passed out in the hold from drink. Ah, Edward. Everyone's gone now, ain't they? Mary, Rackham, Thatch, and all the rest. I missed the lot, rough as they were. Do you feel that too? All empty inside, like? I do, I said. Devil curse me, I do. I remembered a time when Mary had put her hand on my knee, and I did the same to Anne now. She looked at it there for a moment, knowing it was as much an invitation as a gesture of comfort. And then she put her own hand to mine, rested her head on my chest, and we stayed like that for a while. Neither of us said anything. There was no need to. 62. April 1721. Now was the time to start putting things right. It was time to tie up loose ends, to take care of business. It was time to begin wreaking my revenge. Rogers, Torres, Roberts, they all had to die. I stood on the deck of the Jackdaw with Adewale and Artabai. I know my targets by sight well enough, but how will I find them? We have spies and informants in every city, said Artabai. Visit our bureaus, and the assassins there will guide you. That fixes Torres and Rogers, I told him, but Bartholomew Roberts won't be near any city. Might take months to find him. Or years, agreed Artabai. But you are a man of talent and quality, Captain Kenway. I believe you will find him. Adewale looked at me. And if you are at a loss, do not be afraid to lean on your quartermaster for aid, he smiled. I nodded my thanks, then went on to the poop deck, leaving Artabai and Adewale to descend the Jacob's ladder to a rowing boat bobbling by our hull. Quartermaster, I said, what's our present course? She turned, resplendent in her pirate outfit. Due east, Captain, if it's still Kingston we're sailing for. It is, Miss Bonny, it is. Call it out. Weigh anchor and let fall the courses, lads, she called, and she shone with happiness. We're sailing for Jamaica. Torres, then. At the bureau in Kingston I was told of his whereabouts, that he would be attending a political function in town that very night. After that, his movements were uncertain. It needed to be tonight, whether I liked it or not. So, how? I decided to take on the guise of a visiting diplomat, Ruggiero Ferraro, and before I left took a letter from within my robes and handed it to the bureau chief. A letter for Caroline Scott Kenway of Hawkins Lane, Bristol. In it I asked after her. Are you safe? Are you well? A letter full of hope, but burdened with worry. Later that night I found the man I was looking for, Ruggiero Ferraro. In short order I killed him, took his clothes, and joined the others as we made our way to the party, and there were welcomed inside. Being there took me back to when I'd posed as Duncan Walpole, when I'd first visited Torres's mansion. That feeling of being overawed, out of place, and possibly even out of my depth, but chasing some notion of fortune, looking for the quickest way to make easy money. Now I was once again looking for something. I was looking for Woodes Rogers. But riches were no longer my primary concern. I was an assassin now. You are Mr. Ferraro, I take it, said a pretty female guest. I do adore your frippery. Such elegance and colour. Thank you, madam, thank you. I gave her a deep bow in what I hoped was the Italian manner. Pretty she may have been, but I had enough ladies in my life for the time being. Caroline waiting at home, not to mention certain feelings for Anne. And then, just as I realised that grazie was the only Italian word I knew, Woodes Rogers was giving a speech. Ladies and gentlemen, a toast to my brief tenure as Governor of the Bahamas. For under my watch no less than 300 avowed pirates took the King's pardon and swore fealty to the Crown. His face twisted into a bitter, sarcastic sneer. And yet for all my successes, His Majesty has seen fit to sack me and call me home to England. Brilliant! It was a bad-tempered, resentful end to the speech, and sure enough his guests didn't quite know what to make of it. During his time on Nassau he'd handed out religious leaflets trying to persuade the merry buccaneers of New Providence to mend their hard-drinking, whoring ways, so perhaps he wasn't accustomed to the liquor, and he seemed to wobble around his own party, ranting at anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves in the vicinity. Hooray! Hooray for the ignoble and ignorant prigs who rule the world with sticks up their arses! Hooray! Moving on, and another guest winced as he let fly with his whinges. I brought those brutes in Nassau to heel, by God! And this is the thanks I get. Unbelievable! I followed him around the room, staying out of his eye line, trading greetings with the guests. I must have bowed 100 times, murmured grazie 100 times, until at last Rogers appeared to have exhausted the goodwill of his friends, for as he made another circle of the hall he found more and more backs were turned. The next moment he swayed, marooned in the room, looking around himself, only to find his erstwhile friends engaged in more thrilling conversations. For a second I saw the Woodes Rogers of old as he composed himself, drew back his shoulders, raised his chin, and decided to take a little air. I knew where he was going probably before he did, so it was an easy matter to move out to the balcony ahead of him and wait for him there. And then, when he arrived, to bury my blade into his shoulder, and with one hand over his mouth to stop him screaming, lower him to the floor of the balcony, and sit him up against the balustrade. It all happened too quickly for him, too quickly to fight back, too quickly to even be surprised, and he tried to focus on me with drunken, pained eyes. You were a privateer once, I said to him. How is it you lack so much respect for sailors only trying to make their way in this world? He looked at where my blade was still embedded in his shoulder and neck. It was all that kept him alive, because as soon as I removed it, his artery would be open, the balcony would be awash with his blood, and he would be dead within a minute. You couldn't possibly understand my motives, he said with a sardonic smile. You, who spent a whole lifetime dismantling everything that makes our civilization shine. But I do understand, I insisted. I've seen the observatory, and I know its power. You'd use that device to spy. You Templars would use that device to spy and blackmail and sabotage. He nodded, but the movement pained him. Blood soaked his shirt and jacket. Yes, and yet all for a greater purpose, to ensure justice, to snuff out the lies and to seek truth. There's no man on earth who needs that power. Yet you suffer the outlaw Roberts to use it. I shook my head to put him right about that. No, I'm taking it back. And if you tell me where he is, I'll stop Roberts. Africa, he said, and I pulled my blade free. Blood flowed heavily from his neck and his body sagged against the balustrade, undignified in death. What a difference to the man I'd first met all those years ago at Torres's mansion. An ambitious man with a handshake as firm as his resolve. And now his life ended not just at my blade, but in a drunken fugue, a morass of bitterness and shattered dreams. Though he'd ousted the pirates from Nassau, he hadn't been given the support he needed to finish the job. The British had turned their backs on him. His hopes of rebuilding Nassau had been shattered. Blood puddled on the stone around me, and I moved my feet to avoid it. His chest rose and fell, slowly. His eyes were half closed, and his breathing became irregular as life slipped away. Then from behind came a scream, and startled I turned to see a woman, the finery of her clothes in stark contrast to her demeanour, a hand over her mouth, and wide, terrified eyes. There was the rumble of running feet, more figures appearing on the balcony. Nobody daring to tackle me, but not withdrawing either. Just watching. I cursed, stood, and vaulted to the balustrade. To my left, the balcony filled with guests. Lies. We came under fire from all sides, and as British shot peppered our gunwales and shook our shrouds, I gave Anne the order to make haste away. Me? I was going for a swim. It isn't easy to swim from one ship to another, especially if both are involved in battle. But then most are not gifted with my determination. I had the cover of the half-light on my side, not to mention the fact that the crew of the Fortune already had enough to contend with. When I climbed aboard, I found a ship in disarray, a ship I was able to pass through virtually undetected. I took my fair share of scalps along the way, and I'd cut the throat of the first mate and killed the quartermaster before I found Black Bart, who turned to face me with his sword drawn. I noted, almost with amusement, that he had changed his clothes. He had put on his best bib and tucker to meet the English, a crimson waistcoat and breeches, a hat with a red feather, a pair of pistols on silk slings over his shoulders. What hadn't changed were those eyes of his, those dark eyes that were surely a reflection of the blackened, corroded soul inside. We fought, but it was not a fight of any distinction. Black Bart Roberts was a cruel man, a cunning man, a wise man, if wisdom can exist in a man so devoid of humanity,